Welcome to Grand Central Radio, the grandparents' community platform. I'm your host, Geri Cole. This is a talk, listen, and act show for grandparents and future grandparents everywhere. My adult child, that child's spouse and in-laws, and my 2 young grandchildren give me lots of questions and concerns. Like you, I want to be as effective for my grandkids and their parents as possible. To achieve these goals, I also want to stay physically and mentally fit and have fun. We can help each other by sharing our challenges and ideas about grandparenting and our lives as grandparents. You can replay our shows, find stories and songs to hear or read aloud, lists including the ultimate grandparents emergency babysitting checklist and sitter's memorandum form, and a list of movies about grandparents' relationships, and other materials curated especially for grandparents. And contact me, Geri Cole, on our secure website, grandcentralradio.com, or at geri.cole@grandcentralradio.com. If you would like to participate in the recording of one or more of our future podcast episodes, or if you suggest a possible sponsor of our shows or website, please email our show's producer at info@grandcentralradio.com. We appreciate art, we love nature, and we want to pass on that appreciation and love and share them with our grandchildren. Our discussion topic today is introducing grandchildren to nature through art, and to art through nature, with our special guest, Kristin Reiber Harris, an artist, animator, educator, and creator of short animated documentaries about the natural world and her transition from rural Virginia to Brooklyn in New York City, and 3 coloring books celebrating the flora and parks of New York City. She produced educational media for 34 years, including series for HBO Family, HBO Latino, PBS, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She taught art in college and developed workshops teaching children in grades K through 12 to animate their own experiences in the natural world. A devoted grandma, she is committed to visual storytelling about that world, both static and animated, and to encouraging careful observation of nature and our connection with all life. You will hear on this podcast Kristin's personal views on this topic. Those views do not constitute the views of any of her publishers, sponsors, syndicators, or affiliates, or any legal, medical, mental health, or other advice by her, me, or Grand Central Radio. We urge all listeners to discuss with their legal, medical, mental health, and other advisors and counselors their particular concerns and difficulties that might require professional intervention. Kristin, thank you for joining us on Grand Central Radio.
Well, hello, everyone. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about 3 aspects of my life that have been very important to me for over 50 years, and to think about that intersection in a way that I wouldn't if I weren't having this conversation with you. And those 3 are kids and kids in education, art, and the natural world. And I've been very fortunate to be a teaching artist for 50 years, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, that's wonderful. You have a degree in fine art from the University of California in Los Angeles and a master's in fine art from George Washington University. When, where, and why did you discover your connections to art and nature and link them to one another?
Well, it's interesting when I saw your question, because I realized that for me, nature was first. I was incredibly lucky to grow up on an old farm in Northern Virginia and have 20 acres of fields and woods and trees to wander. And so as a young child, I was hooked. In fact, I was very entertained recently when I saw in my baby book that my mom said as a toddler, I would just go stand at the front door, like, get me out of here. I want to be out there. So that was really the first. It was having an opportunity to really roll in the grass and climb trees as a kid. I went to UCLA to study Latin American studies. I did not go to study art. And while I was there, this is in the late 60s, And while I was there, I realized that, to put it sort of bluntly, if I was going to stay in college, I was going to do something that I really cared about in a different way, and that was art. Because I'm not a scholar, I'm a creative, and I make things. So the art connection came as a college student, and my subject matter, literally for the past 50 years, has been probably 90% plants and flowers and aspects of the natural world that engage me physically and visually. My dad had a big garden and my mom was a gardener. So appreciating the natural world was something that I grew up with. And as an artist, as a student, obviously you're being directed in what you're doing. But I realized that what I was seeing, what was stimulating me visually, were aspects of the natural world. So they really happened simultaneously. There wasn't a shift from one to the other. Because the nature was first, when the art was evolving, it naturally became the subject matter.
I understand that. How did you develop and how do you maintain your knowledge and experience in educating children about art and nature?
Well, again, I was even as a college student, I worked in a daycare center. So I love children. And on a good day, I say my mental age is 5 because I have the greatest respect for 5-year-olds. So I have been working with children for a very, very long time. And when my kids were little, I'd volunteer in their classrooms. And one of the things I do we'd go in and read a book because I like the idea of reading too. And then we do an art project related to that. So I've just been working with kids for 50 years. And of course, as we all know, we learn by doing and doing more and more and more.
Right. Now, with all that experience you've had working with kids in the art and nature setting, what have you found to be the challenges to teachers, parents, and grandparents in talking about art and nature with children from toddler through high school? And how do those challenges vary depending upon the ages of the children?
Well, I prefer to not see challenges, but to see opportunities. And I think possibly critical is that you are showing your own appreciation and respect for the natural world. So if you don't have that, it's kind of hard to pretend, just as it is with art. And I think hopefully we all are deeply in love with our Mother Earth, and we want to share that. And it's not something that's hard for us to do. And of course, it is very age. I mean, a 3-year-old, my grandson's 3, he's not like every other 3-year-old, or just like a teenager isn't like every other teenager. But we trust our judgment on what's appropriate as we're interacting with our grandchildren or with anybody's children as to what's appropriate and what they can respond to. And now with my 3-year-old grandson, like walking him home yesterday, the 15 blocks or however long it was, I take him in the stroller to walk home, is where it's very windy and we're looking at the trees and what the wind is doing in the trees, and just being as aware of the environment as it is reflected in natural objects as opposed to concrete and fire trucks and other things that he's interested in too.
Well, this ties nicely actually into some discussions we had in our last podcast episode about environmental literacy, especially with very young children, and starting with introducing them to nature and doing exactly what you've just suggested that grandparents do with their young children and young grandchildren, in the context of exposing them to nature and the beauty of nature that makes it artistic. Now, how do you suggest, other than those kinds of activities, that grandparents discuss art and nature with their grandchildren generally, and what art and nature related projects can grandparents engage in with their grandchildren? How do these discussions and projects vary depending upon where and with whom the grandchildren live?
There's thousands of things that can be done, but of course, my sort of the bedrock and the foundation for me of all of this is drawing, and drawing is something that can be done by a 1-year-old with crayons on paper from the recycling bin. So the materials are readily accessible. And in terms of drawing. You can be drawing inside and telling a story about something that you did outside. You can be outside at the park doing drawings while you're there at what you're looking at. One of the things that I really like doing is I just started a nature notebook for my grandson. And what I've done in that is I have taped in leaves on one side, and on the other side, I have an outline of that leaf and the name of the leaf. And so when he goes into it in colors, because he's 3, he's certainly not paying any attention to anything except making marks on the paper. But I think the idea of a nature notebook where you have one document that you go back to and add drawings is a wonderful idea, because it is by drawing that you really see an object.
And you could use this journaling approach, notebook approach for older children as well, couldn't you?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, they would be much more proactive. I did a great program when I was in Lynchburg at the Mayer Museum, and we had these nature notebooks. And I believe that for that exhibit, there were these incredibly beautiful photographs of elephants in Africa. And so this was a great way to give them something aligned there. And they're not expensive, just a composition book with no lines. And that would be something that they could keep and go back to.
Right, and treasure it. And treasure it when they're older and show it to their children and grandchildren at some point. Right.
Yes, hopefully that would be it. So the other, I mean, in terms of nature and art, there are in smaller communities, there are wonderful art museums and galleries. And then in a place like New York City, there are incredible museums that have, I couldn't tell you what the percentage of art in the museum is directly related to the natural world, but it's very large percentage. So there's all kinds of wonderful things to see that artists have done since really the beginning of time as an inspiration.
Well, hoping we're coming into at least a temporary respite from the pandemic, but we're all aware that the COVID-19 pandemic has affected all of our lives. How has it affected the discussions and projects that you suggest between grandchildren and their grandparents?
Well, unfortunately, it affected me personally by having COVID and also my grandson having COVID. So there were times when we couldn't see each other at all. But it hasn't been something that I've discussed with a 3-year-old, and we get to the park as often as we can. So right now it's more our outdoor activity, because outdoor activity was never really something that you could not do. We've been able to do that together, and that's made a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you're looking forward to those moments with him, and it's even richer because you've been deprived of it for such a long time. How and where can we obtain more information about talking with grandchildren and organizing projects with them about art and nature?
Well, I'm going to be providing a list with PDFs that Geri's going to tell you about in terms of resources. But YouTube is a wonderful source. I am a huge advocate for doing things with paper. I love paper. My work for 50 years has been on paper. So I like making animals out of paper, not just drawing it, but having it, working dimensionally. And there are all kinds of wonderful resources online that can help you if you need to see somebody doing it. Also, a lot of parks have wonderful educational programs, and on their websites, they have ideas for activities. There's North American Association of Environmental Educators, which is a fabulous resource. You don't even have to be a member to have them send you a newsletter to get access to all of the resources that they have on their website. So I recommend that very highly as a wonderful source of ideas. In fact, one of the ideas I just got from them was that in May is the International Migrating Fish Day, and they're having a fish flag competition. And I think that's just a wonderful thing to focus on, because most of us don't think about migrating fish. And it's a great activity. Okay, let's make a fish flag. And even better to look at what the Japanese have done making fish flags. They're really, really beautiful objects. So there's lots out there.
Well, our other guests, please ask Kristin Reiber Harris your questions and share your ideas about introducing grandchildren to nature through art and to art through nature. Dorothy in Scarsdale, New York, what are you thinking about talking with grandchildren about this topic?
Well, one thing I'm wondering about is the nature of the materials that are used. I mean, I like to draw, and I'm pretty good at it, drawing with, I actually took a class in botanical drawing last summer. And we learned how to draw with colored pencils and with watercolors. And having really good materials made a huge difference to me. So when I hear you say crayons, I just kind of cringe, because my memory of crayons from when I was a kid is that they didn't actually, result in really nice pictures. And so I'm wondering, at what age is it appropriate to give children good materials like pastels and watercolors and black pens and that sort of thing?
Well, I'm smiling when you're talking about crayons, because I have spent years working with something I call expensive crayons, because they are. But Caran d'Ache makes something called Neo colors, which are beautifully saturated. They look like crayons. I mean, they're the same shape and wrapped in paper and everything. So there are materials that are as immediate and direct as working with crayons. I hear you. Crayons, haven't been the most elegant tool to use to make art. But I think, because I certainly am very much in favor of grandparents supporting interests financially. And so I would say that, the investment comes when you are satisfied that there is true interest and they're not going to be wasted. But it's really important to make sure that they're not toxic. And I just got my grandson some markers, and I was real picky, because I hate the fumes of most markers anyway.
Yeah.
So you have grandchildren, Dorothy, that are expressing real interest, and you want to invest, or you?
Well, I have a grandson who is, in my view, and his parents, a brilliant child, and he is very interested in nature. He goes around and collects sticks and stones in his little basket, but unfortunately, he does not have much manual dexterity. His idea of coloring and drawing is a little bit disappointing. So that's another question I'm thinking about when I hear you, because I think that, sometimes when you draw a leaf and he draws a leaf, they might not be at all similar,
Oh, I'm so glad you brought this up, because I made a little list of guidelines, and one is easy access to supplies. I remember where the drawer was in my kitchen as a kid that had the clay in it, but also to be totally non-judgmental in your interaction with what they're doing. So that's not reasonable to think that a child is going to draw the same way an adult does, even if the adult doesn't have any experience as an artist. It's not realistic, but it's also not the point. The point is his creative expression.
And obviously, the more he does it, the better he gets at it. One thing I've seen on this, I follow this Facebook group for nature journalists. If you don't know it, you should follow it. I mean, it's just really full of amazing drawing methods. But one thing I've seen a number of people do is that they have parallel journals they keep with their kids, so that the mother and the child both look at a leaf and they have their own journals that they, record this in. And it can be, I think the modeling can be a good thing for the child.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I would say definitely have do your own drawing while your grandchild is drawing. And, but you don't have to say this is how it really looks, of course, and what you're doing can be better, because that's not relevant and it's certainly not encouraging.
Right. Of course.
But yeah, parallel journals. I think that's a great idea. Or I've had my grandson draw in my notebook, in my sketchbook. So it can go both ways.
Yeah, you're right. I did that too. When I was down in South Carolina with my grandson, it was right after I'd taken my botanical drawing class. So I had my materials down there and I had my notebook down there. And I let him draw in the back of the journal, so he drew a storm cloud and that sort of thing in my journal. And that was terrific.
I think so. I love looking back at my journals now or my notebooks, my sketchbooks, and seeing, what my daughter, who's now 35, did when she was 3 in my notebook.
Right.
Right. Did you see any progression, by the way? Did you see any pattern developed, Kristin, from the age of 3 to an adult? Some similarities in style or focus or theme?
Neither one of my children are artists. My daughter is an art historian and my son is an astronomer. So they whatever, I was thrilled that they both got to grow up in my studio, but it didn't stick in terms of convincing them that it was something they wanted to do. And they're both smarter than I am. So,
Everyone's smarter in their own way, I think. You have to find your own path, right? Stuart, in Wayne, New Jersey, you told our show's producer that you're involved with the Laurelwood Arboretum in Wayne. What is your experience with combining art and nature?
Well, yes. So laurelwoodarboretum.org is the park's website, 30-acre park in Wayne, New Jersey. I'd encourage anyone who's listening to this podcast to visit, because my wife and I spearheaded to the creation of a sculpture trail, which is free and available. It takes about an hour to walk through, and there are audio tour along the way to learn about the pieces. So my goal was to meld art with nature, because the Arboretum is beautiful in its own right, and these sculptures complement it. And, listening to some of the back and forth between your guests, not everyone can create art, but everyone can appreciate it. And the appreciation of art in connection with nature, and to see how one complements the other, is a lesson for all. The creativity that you see and can explain to your grandchild as you walk through the park. Everyone can walk through the park. We have golf carts there as well if you can't walk. And you can see how the sculptures complement the surrounding environment or contrast with it. You can explain to your grandchild how the pieces are made. I have no art training whatsoever. And the creativity that you see, if you can appreciate it, it bleeds over to your life, whatever you do. The idea that you can take, discarded pieces of metal and weld them together and create something that has an expression that you can see and explain to your grandchild is, I think, terrific. And so I don't care how, my grandchild draws. I just like the fact that he might look at something and try to draw it. And I think this sculpture trail is a wonderful opportunity for people to do that. I grew up in Brooklyn, and I really appreciate nature because there was no nature essentially in Brooklyn except for like 1 or 2 parks that if you were lucky enough, you would get to visit once, every couple of months. And when I was a young child, we spent them in the summers up in the Catskill Mountains of New York, and that really influenced me. And that's why I loved my involvement with Laurelwood. I like it so much because it gives me an opportunity to appreciate nature and to help create, a sculpture trail. It was quite an effort, and I think I'd invite everyone to come up, and we'll have our curator give you a tour and walk you around and tell you why he selected various pieces for particular locations and how you can see what inspired him.
Stuart, can you explain from your own experience with your own grandchild or grandchildren, which parts of Laurelwood and maybe other aspects of nature, other places that you've gone with them outside of the Arboretum, that they seem to be most drawn to, most inspired by?
Sure. The Arboretum has a defined trail, and the pieces, there are 14 of them currently at the park, and they're in various spots along the internal roadway of the Arboretum. The ones that seem to resonate the most, there's the larger sculptures that are juxtaposed against their backgrounds. There's one in particular called Pi in the Sky. It's the mathematical symbol pi, and it glistens in the sun. It changes depending upon which time of day you look at it. People seem to, and kids particularly, seem to gravitate to that because it's like mathematical and scientific principles, in an artistic form. And they seem to like that one the best, as well as there are two sort of large-scale Stonehenge-like faces, visages that are made out of brick, that are like African-oriented, that have religious sort of connotation to it, and there's a story behind it. So if something has a story that and you understand what the artist was trying to do, that particularly resonates with young kids. We also had a family day this past spring where we had art educators take children out to particular sculptures, and they did a lesson plan about the sculpture, had them draw, had them paint, had them try to create something out of clay. So that hands-on experience is also very popular. We're going to probably do it again this spring and summer. So a story, an explanation of how the piece is made, and how you can try to make one yourself. It resonates really well with young kids.
So I think that Kristin had mentioned this earlier on, too, that storytelling is a very important stimulus to children and adults of all ages, actually, in generating their art and their appreciation for nature and their surroundings.
I would agree. And I've never made art in my life. I have no skill in that area, but I really do appreciate it. And what you can instill in your grandchildren is that if you appreciate art, it will help you in whatever you decide to do in life. And more importantly, perhaps, it will support those people who create it. Artists need to make a living and earn a living. And you can help them do that. And by doing that, by buying art, by appreciating it, by going to their events, you help your community. I was up in New York State at a local Art Alliance, and I overheard a conversation by the curator, which is really true. Art, when it's appreciated, it can rejuvenate urban areas. And for every dollar that is spent on art in like an area that has been devoted to arts, like Wynwood Gardens, Wynwood Walls, I think it's called, in Miami and other areas like that, for every dollar that is spent on art, $9 is spent on the restaurants and the businesses that are there in that area. And so that's it's maybe it's a sophisticated concept to instill in your grandchildren, but if you support art, it really helps the community in a lot of different ways that you might not think as a young kid, but as you get older and see what neighborhoods have been downtrodden that get rejuvenated, it's largely because of art.
Jill in Lynchburg, Virginia, could you please share your questions and your ideas?
Yes, I am a very new grandma. My first grandchild is only 2 months old. So obviously, we have not had any art experiences together yet, but I'm looking forward to sharing art with him. I am an artist. A lot of my work is nature-based, and I have done a lot of teaching of art to children through art camps and Girl Scouts and artist and education residencies. So I'm really looking forward to sharing art and nature with my grandson. And I also love camping. So I'm looking forward to camping with him. And I love Kristin's idea of the book with an actual leaf taped in and then ability to draw next to it. And I think it's really important to reiterate what Kristin said about not having any expectations of the quote unquote quality of the drawing that the child makes, but just rejoice in the mark making. So if Kristin has any suggestions for what other sort of things to put into a nature sampler, in essence, that would be wonderful.
Kristin, do you have any more suggestions about the nature notebook?
Jill and I are dear friends. We've known each other for years, and she has a pile of sticks and rocks in her house, just like I do. And I wish they would go in the notebook too. But that's not realistic. But you could do tracings of the stick, or you could do a drawing of rocks. Unfortunately, for the journal, it needs to be something that's flat. But that doesn't mean that it can't also be collecting images. We all get mail that gets put in recycling that has photographs of natural objects. And I just I'm going to interject because I want to stand up for my neighborhood in Brooklyn. Mother Nature is well and thriving here. I'm sure when Stuart was a little boy, it may have been different, but there are wonderful, incredible parks I'm in Bay Ridge, and the street trees are truly amazing. And the city has a street tree map, and I can go in and identify any tree by location and get information about it. So Mother Nature is everywhere, even if it's 2 square inches of dirt.
Jean in Moscow, Idaho, thank you for joining us. Would you like to add something to our conversation?
I've had a question formulating here, listening to all of you talk. And that is, Kristin, I've been following you, just kind of keeping an eye on you for a long time. And I know that for quite a while, it seemed like you were really emphasizing online things, computer programming for kids. Now, correct me if I'm going off, if this isn't true, but it seemed like you were for quite a while working on projects that children had to, that they would work with online. And I've noticed that more recently, your artwork is very direct between you and your materials and your paper, usually. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about this conundrum that we have with our grandchildren who've grown with, they're born with cell phones in their hands. And me as the grandparent now, I have a continual frustration with technology. I admire you so much because I think you've jumped on the bandwagon early and it doesn't give you that much trouble. But I wonder if you have anything to say about online art activities, production versus the directness that I also see in your work now, especially.
Well, thank you for asking that question, because one of the things that I intend to emphasize in this conversation today is using iPads or making art, and also for animation. And partially because it's really fun. And it's also something that, as we all know, is easier for the children in a way because they've grown up with it. But there are some incredible apps for teaching kids animation that are very accessible. I mean, in my years of doing workshops, I sort of determined that by the time kids were 7 or 8, as much as one can generalize, they could understand the concept of sequential imaging, meaning you're doing this series of drawings and they need to change a little bit over each one over time in order to create an animation. But it really, talking about animation, just not even doing it and all of the aspects of eye science and why do we see sequential images as a single moving, and then the act of creating it. And in the workshops, I have a blog. I'll put a link to some of the workshops I've done with kids where we go out in the woods and then you come back into the workshop at the art center or nature center and you animate, meaning you make a series of drawings that that tell a story about some creature that you saw. And it's a wonderful way to have balance. I think both are really important. I did develop and produce apps for a while. Now my situation has changed in that I left my connections for teaching and have been really involved in my own work. But I think taking advantage of children's natural inclination to use these wonderful devices and the tools that are available lets them make a story.
And for me, this is Jill. I am not prone to wanting to do any animation because of it involving iPads and computers. But apps that I would definitely use with my grandchildren are the ones that you use to identify plants, like Seek, and I can't think of what the other ones are, so that when you're out with them, you can go, and when they ask, what is that plant? And I don't know, use an app to identify plants or butterflies and things would be how I would use technology. But I'm not comfortable with the different apps for doing animations. So I would kind of have to rely on somebody else to help with that. I'm much more hands-on, and drawing or painting would be in my wheelhouse.
Hi, this is Dorothy of Scarsdale. I'm fascinated by this talk about iPads. Twice now it's come to my attention that young people use iPads to do drawing. I think they use a program called Procreate, maybe. And I've seen both on the Facebook Nature Journal page, and as well as my daughter has told me that her generation sketches on iPads, which is hard for me to understand how that might be. But certainly the pictures I've seen have been extraordinary. So I think it is something that maybe as grandmothers should learn something about.
That's an excellent suggestion, Dorothy. Do any of the grandparent guests have any questions or comments on anything the other grandparent guests have said in this discussion?
I guess I have a natural skepticism, which I'm not proud of, but of seeing how children watch television, for example, they watch an animation. And I suppose that this idea of learning something about it with them would probably be very good for me because my tendency is to think, oh, come on, you don't need another hour of this.
Jean, I think that's a good point. My daughter does not let her children have any screen time. So therefore, any kind of YouTube or that sort of thing is not going to work. It's going to have to be in real life. And frankly, experiencing nature, the best way to do it is...
Yeah, but you have to realize that you might be doing them a disservice by not allowing them to have access to something they're going to be dealing with their whole lives. So, I certainly think that's a great idea, depending on the ages of her children, but it's something she probably couldn't sustain. However, yeah, I think also just the fact that they'll be grounded in something that probably most children won't be grounded in, which is, having to deal with the world not through a screen here for a while. That'll be a very interesting experiment on her part.
Yeah, as they get older, they will experience more screens. And I do feel that they are being deprived of some cultural experiences by not being allowed to, say, watch a concert or that sort of thing. But I have to tell you, the results are extraordinary. To see the children playing with each other apart from any screens is very different from what you see around here in Scarsdale.
What do you have to say about that, Kristin? I want to hear your thoughts.
I think that it's important to be up with what's happening now. And I'm sure it's possible to control screen time at home, but that they're getting it at school because it's such a valuable tool in education. So I think it's just a matter of finding balance, because I think it's sticking your head in the dirt to think that this isn't a wonderful tool that we need to take advantage of, but not let rule us. And
And I think there's a big difference between learning how to animate and create for a screen instead of just blankly sitting in the screen being a receptor.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
So I can see the absolute benefits of learning Procreate and drawing or sketching on an iPad or computer. It just, that does not interest me at all. And I work in an art supply store part-time, and I am shocked when college-age students come in and all of their artwork has been done on computers, and they're really nervous about, I've never held a paintbrush before. I've never touched, paint. And so for me, it's such a physical act, and the sensuousness of paint and getting it on your hands and working with it, to me is critical. And for little kids who are sensory creatures, touching and holding and molding, to me, is absolutely critical. And obviously it is age dependent. A 3-year-old's art experience is going to be very different from a middle schooler's. But I would always want any age child to have experience with physically holding and manipulating art supplies.
Yeah, and making marks.
And making marks, lots of marks.
Yes, lots of marks, but hopefully not on the wall.
Yes.
Could all of you comment on your experience with access to these art supplies? Many of us live in communities where they're readily available to children of all ages, but not everyone lives in that kind of a community. What can grandparents do with their grandchildren where they don't have ready access to paints and canvases and easels and other types of supplies that you would find in a nice art store in a more affluent area?
Well, there's nothing better for me than going into an art store and seeing all the supplies. I was down in Savannah, Georgia, and there's an art school down there, and I went in the art store. I was just delighted, to be surrounded by all these materials. I adore them. However, I will say that, the woman who taught me the botanical drawing class, she has a website where you can order art supplies, and I see on the Nature Journal page on Facebook that there are a lot of places to order these from online. So even if you don't live in a town that has an art supply store, I think they're easily come by.
And yes, you can get just about anything online. And I think the other thing is you have to consider people's budgets, and you don't have to have fancy art supplies in order to do mark making and art with children. If you have, as Kristin said, paper from the recycle bin and a pencil, you can do amazing things with learning about nature by sketching or making rubbings of things with crayons.
Rubbings of bark and stuff. Yeah, they're great things to do with rubbings.
I'm a big believer that you can basically take almost anything and make art out of it. For example, I've always had a hard time pitching out favorite dishes that might break. So I basically have a place in my yard where anything that breaks gets thrown into that path. And then I've had a lot of fun. I also go to secondhand stores around here sometimes, and I'll buy plates because they're cheap. I feel kind of bad sometimes because I'll buy a yellow plate and then I just come home and put it under canvas and bash it up with my hammer. And I've done some bird baths, and I've held little classes where I teach art camps as well, where the kids will make mosaics and or garden step stools. There's so many things that you can do if you just start looking around and have your grandchildren say, "Hey, here's some seeds on the ground. This are from this chestnut tree. Could we do something with that?" Maybe come home and find some way to drill holes in it and make a squirrel necklace. I think because I started teaching,
or glue it to paper, to paper and make a design, make a mosaic of stuff you found on a walk.
I also have one other thing to stick in here. I have a studio, which is now, because we all get excited when we're buying supplies, I think. Now I feel like I can't use up all the supplies I have if I had 2 more lifetimes. So it's a question of trying to, give some things away, offer them to art teachers, or maybe sell some things if they're valuable and you don't care like giving them away. But I have known a lot of people who get so much joy out of purchasing things and then having them and never using them. So
That's true. It's like all those knitters who have all those balls and balls of yarn. But, I think that it's sort of scandalous how poor art supplies can be in public schools. And, they just don't have good supplies in some of them. And so that would be a good place to give these extra supplies if possible.
Sure. Yeah.
Excellent. Have any of you had experience in creating color from natural objects and from natural plants and what you find in the real world?
Like making charcoal. Take some, go out to your burn barrel or when you're camping, get some sticks and just burn them down, till they're not dark anymore. Burn them till they're little burnt embers, and then show your kids how you can make marks with that. It's like charcoal. It's maybe look up a little bit about how the Chinese valued precious ink so much, and they were the various things they would make it out of, like bones. And so that's been one of my favorites, is to have the kids help make their own charcoal.
Yeah, and there are definitely things, flowers and plants in nature that you can use to make colors with. And I think that's an incredible idea, Geri. I love that idea. When I was little, I thought it was cool to make colored eggs by wrapping hard-boiled eggs in onion skins and tying them in, paper and then string and boiling them, and the eggs would come out, looking like ovoid onions. And so that's the only kind of experience I can remember actually doing it myself.
And I do both eco printing and nature printing. So with nature printing, you take the actual leaf and roll ink on it and then press the ink side down onto paper or fabric. I also do eco printing, which is where you take leaves, put them on fabric or paper, and then simmer it for, 2 hours or something. And the pigment in the leaves transfers to the fabric or paper. So I do both of those, which with supervision can be done with children. Finding various windfall leaves and taking paper or fabric or a t-shirt and layering it up. And then obviously the supervision comes in during the boiling process, like with the Easter eggs. But that's a wonderful way to get imagery onto fabric and paper.
You're reminding me that I think printmaking, pulling prints, is one of the most fascinating things for the kids if they've never done it, which most have never done. And Kristin, I think, have you done printmaking with kids?
I think in Lynchburg, I think I did do some woodcuts with kids, but there's potato prints. There's a million ways that you can create relief prints to work with kids that doesn't involve sharp knives and pieces of wood.
I gave a demonstration at the Round Hill Appalachian Trail Festival this last September, which was related to nature printing, and the kids loved it that got to do it. And so it was a multiple printing process, because I had them ink a leaf and print it and then print a base for the leaf to go on. But it was, the youngest was, I think she was 5 years old, and she really got into it. So printing, and I'm a printmaker, and the nature printing aspect can be done with any age child, whereas, as Kristin says, with wood and linoleum and sharp tools, that's not as accessible for little kids, and also probably for most grandparents, because that would be an investment in tools and printing plates, whereas if you do nature printing, you need the ink and a way to apply the ink, and so it's really quite accessible to all ages of children and a variety of financial budgets.
So, Stuart, you said you haven't done any artwork, but are you getting kind of excited now? Got a couple of ideas?
Yeah, I wish I had the skills, but my wife is an excellent artist, and my eldest grandson I think has a lot of talent from what I'm seeing, and I enjoy that. I hang his pictures up in my office and try to encourage him to continue to do things like that. And that's where I see my contribution is to be a cheerleader, to encourage anyone I know who expresses an interest in art to keep doing it and support artists if you enjoy it.
Boy, do we sure need people like you. So thank you.
Yes, Stuart, thank you. But you're talking to a bunch of art teachers who think that anybody can make art. So when you say you don't have the skill, I don't believe you.
I mean, I think I'm very creative. I come from a family. One of my cousins is a very successful actor, a Hollywood actor, and so we have that in our family where people are creative, and I take my creativity, not in drawing and in sculpting and things like that, but in applying it to problem solving, if that makes any sense.
Well, let me take the contrary view, because I can tell you that first of all, to pick up on the basic insight that Kristin shared with us in the beginning, seeing nature is something you can do through drawing. To draw some natural object is to see it better. And I see this over and over again, both in the botanical drawings that I've done and in what I see with others doing botanical drawings. I mean, they don't really see what's inside a flower in terms of its reproductive system until they draw it. And then when you said, let others be creative, nature drawing's not all that creative. What it is you look at something, and like, even if it's just a stick or a stone, and you draw it. And the worst kind of drawings are those where people they make it up out of their head what they think a flower should look like. But if they're actually looking at the flower and drawing it, it will be pretty good, I think.
And I take a contrary view to that. I think for people who are uncomfortable with drawing, the point isn't necessarily to make it realistic, but how does it make you feel? Is it the color that excites you? So get some color down. But I think when you try to go, if it's not realistic and perfect, it's no good, that can be unbelievably frustrating and discouraging when you're working with children. Because when I lead tours as a docent at the Mayer Museum in Lynchburg, when you ask a second grade class who's an artist, every child raises their hand. When you ask the same question of fifth graders, only 2 or 3 raise their hands, because by that point they've decided that if their work doesn't look like an adult's work, it's no good and they're not an artist. They've lost that joy of mark making and being creative, and so I think that's why it's so important, as Kristin said, to not be judgmental when you look at the work. And when I work with kids and we're drawing, I'm like, well, what color is the tree's trunk? And I'm like, it doesn't have to be brown. It could be purple. It could be any color. Pick what it is that you want. The point isn't to look like everybody else. The point is to make art that is you.
Okay, well, I wasn't suggesting
it's about creative expression.
I wasn't suggesting that when you sit and when Stuart looks at a stick and actually, does something that looks kind of like the stick, that it has to be perfect. And I wasn't saying there's only one way for it to look. I was just saying that you can be, a wonderful artist if you just look at things and draw them as you see them. And obviously they're all going to be different,
I think it comes around to a foundational thing Kristin's mentioned, which is, expression and then mark making. Just the mark making itself gives a child such wonder. I think sometimes taking things and making their own out of it, making their lines or their smears of color, whatever. I think that's the enchantment that I enjoy or hope to enjoy with my granddaughter as she grows older.
Yeah, it's about creative expression and validation. I am here. I made a mark. And if you look back at the rock drawings from, X number of millions of years ago, I'm not getting the right numbers, but making marks is part of what being a human is all about.
Hear, hear.
Well, I think that is a wonderful place to wrap it up for us. What a fabulous interchange discussion among all of you today. The takeaways from our discussion about introducing grandchildren to nature through art and to art through nature are so many, but I'll try to summarize them here. First, to encourage an appreciation of art and nature, spend time with your grandchild, reveling in both of them, including visiting the Laurelwood Arboretum in Wayne, New Jersey, or its website, laurelwoodarboretum.org, or better yet, both of those, where you can find a sculpture trail and items on that sculpture trail that will appeal to each level of childhood of your grandchildren. You can explore creative materials with your grandchildren. You don't necessarily need expensive art materials for your grandkids or you to be creative. Use whatever is available in nature or otherwise in the real world. Recycled paper, rubbing crayons against stones. Guidelines that Kristin pointed out to us were making those supplies, whatever it is that you decide to use with your grandchildren, easily accessible to your grandchildren. They don't have to ask you for permission to use them. They know where they are in your home and in your yard. Encourage your children, your grandchildren, to make marks as their art. It doesn't have to be perfect, technically competent. It needs just to express what they're feeling and what they're seeing, validating their expression as artists, however old they are or not. Be non-judgmental in your interaction with your grandchildren regarding art. Participate in the activity. Draw yourself while your grandchild draws or otherwise it creates art. Express what you and they feel. For example, you could create parallel journals or parallel nature notebooks for you and your grandchildren. Combine storytelling with art and nature in order to inspire and encourage your grandchildren to participate in these activities. For additional resources, you can go to YouTube and other online resources, including animation instruction videos, work with paper, 3D animals. Parks and museums and libraries provide a lot of resources and materials and reference materials for you and your grandchildren to enjoy and revel in. The North American Association of Environmental Educators has materials and suggestions in this regard, including their International Migratory Fish Day in May. So you can create a fish flag with your grandchildren and find other additional resources that Kristin will supply to us on grandcentralradio.com. Thank you to our special guest, Kristin Reiber Harris, and all of our callers and listeners. Watch for our announcements of our next Grand Central radio show. Our podcasts are posted to iTunes, iHeart, TuneIn, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Blueberry, Listen Notes, YouTube, and our secure website, grandcentralradio.com. Until then, please contact me, Geri Cole, on our secure website, grandcentralradio.com, or contact our show's producer at info@grandcentralradio.com if you have questions or suggestions for us or any of our special guests. If you would like to participate in the recording of one or more of our future podcast episodes, or if you suggest a sponsor of our shows or website. Stay well, safe, and secure, and happy grandparenting!